thank everybody for coming and welcome to the Jerusalem book launch of Seeking Palestine. I'm Penny Johnson, a co-editor of the book, and with me is Shehadeh, a co-editor and contributor to the book, and Rema, Hammami. Our format is I'll just introduce the book fairly briefly, and Resha and Rema will read from their texts in Seeking Palestine. Now, it's not normal, really, to dedicate a book launch, but I would like to dedicate this launch to a young man, Nathan Blank, whose grandmother Judy is in the audience, who's been in prison for 6 months. That's not too long by Palestinian terms, but for refusing to serve in the Israeli army because of the occupation. And protest simmers and emerges at different times, and I'll just direct you to Judy for any questions that you might have about the protests at the end of the session. Now, our book, Seeking Palestine, New Palestinian Writing on Exile and Home, began with an encounter when Ritu Menon, a respected independent publisher in Delhi, in India, arrived in Palestine in 2010 for the Palestine Festival of Literature. Ritu, who is as strong-minded as the Godfather, but her politics are better, made Resha and I an offer we couldn't refuse. She wanted to publish a book that would bring together Palestinian writers to explore new ways of imagining and thinking about exile and home. A successful edition of Seeking Palestine was published in Delhi in 2012. It migrated to Australia, and today we're celebrating the American edition by another good independent publisher and a Jerusalemite, Michelle Mushelbeck of Interlink Olive Branch Press. And it is also, of course, very appropriate to have this launch just as the 2013 Palestine Festival of Literature will begin on the weekend in Rema. Encounters is perhaps a good word for the process that brought this book into being. As we asked contributors, they were essayists, poets, novelists, and visual artists, actually, to consider how Palestinians live, imagine, and think about home and exile 6 decades after the dismemberment of historic Palestine, and in the complicated present tense of a truncated and transitory Palestine. As we began to receive their writings, we were really brought onto new ground. It was fascinating, it was often very intimate, it was provocative, and it was really an encounter between memory and imagination. And I should say one thing it was not, and I don't think any of our writers aimed for this, was representative of Palestine question, representative of Palestinians. Instead, it was an attempt to reimagine. And quite an interesting journey. Neither homeland nor exile are words. And that begins a poem by Mahmoud Darwish that evoked our contributors' journey searching for ways to go beyond conventional words and to probe stories, memories, fragments, images, in order, as Darwish continues, to lift the fog from the hills, and of course the fog from our minds at this very difficult time in Palestine.
Thank you, Penny. As Penny mentioned, my piece is about my adopted neighborhood, Shehadeh, where I've been, which has been my home since the late 80s. I'm originally a Palestinian exile, but I am among probably the extremely lucky few Palestinian exiles in the world who actually made it back home. I mean, I'm a very, very rare breed. But the piece is very much about the fact that of going through another experience of exile, but actually back here within the geography of Palestine. Of the whole process of something that most Palestinians within West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem have been through over the last decade, if not over the last 20 years, which is basically being made exiles within our own patrimony, whilst simultaneously living in it. So my piece tries to trace this process over 20 years as I experienced it within my very immediate neighborhood, which is just up the road. I live in what's sometimes called the upper quarter of Shehadeh, the other hill. And really, in that sense, I've tried to write about my experience in Shehadeh as maybe a window on that experience of what's happened to all of East Jerusalem over these last 2 decades. But I tried to capture it through the small details of everyday life and the small stories of the fabric of the quarter, the fabric of any community, which are its people. I start in '88 and I end in 2002. The meanings of place names in Palestine, unlike other places in the world, tend to change quite dramatically and quite often because so many dramatic events happen here all the time. So you take somewhere like Kalandia, which actually started out as a village, and then it was, Kalandia meant an airport, then it meant a refugee camp, and now it means a checkpoint. Similarly, I think Shehadeh, the meaning of its name has changed really dramatically in the last decade or so. Shehadeh, for people who knew about it, especially Palestinians, was sort of a symbol for an elite generation of Jerusalem families, old mansions, an elite neighborhood of East Jerusalem outside the city walls. And of course, over the last decade, or especially since 2009, and the takeover of family homes in Shehadeh, as well as the regular demonstrations against them, Shehadeh has become a name for something completely else, for house evictions by the Israeli state and settler movement, and for forms of peaceful resistance against them. When I first came to the neighborhood, though, it was still carrying that sense of this old elite neighborhood, the homes of these sort of fading grand Jerusalem families. And what I'm going to read from my piece is really about a specific group of inhabitants of the neighborhood and what happened to them over 20 years. When I first moved to the neighborhood, most of the residents of the quarter were also surviving remnants of a more genteel past. My immediate neighbors were assorted versions of Palestinian Mishavishans, spinsters and widows from Jerusalem's good families who'd been left behind when other families passed away or moved on to more promising futures. Alone in their grand family homes, they busied themselves by spying on the limited action offered by the street and oppressing the various helpers tasked with assisting them in the upkeep of the family shrine. And like any good shrine, their homes were thick with icons and offerings. Each interior, like an overstocked souvenir shop, was sagging with generations of knickknacks, fading colored photos of successful family members at the Eiffel Tower at Disney World, and masses of heavy furniture served up with generous dollops of lace dahlias. It struck me that as long as these old ladies rattled around these overstuffed rooms, wielding their feather dusters and frying garlic for today's lunch, family members of the far corners of the universe could live in the certainty that their ancestral city, Al-Quds, was still a breathing part of their being. Above me lived Mary.
Your colleague says you must raise your voice.
Above me lived Mary in her 80s with red-headed hair and the smoking habits of Colette. She'd spent most of her adult life working at the French consulate and in retirement now hosted a steady stream of visitors from across the West Bank seeking her clairvoyant readings of their coffee grounds. Next door was Midget Lady, and her tall, humorless sister. Midget Lady was a streak of lightning, always out on the front veranda looking for company, waving at passers-by and offering homemade ma'moul to strangers and workmen. Because of this wanton behavior, fairly credible rumors had gone around the neighborhood that she was having an affair with a bus driver who plied the route in front of her house. Next to them was Sit Yusra, a retired UNRWA school teacher, and her slightly retarded brother. She was young and spry at around 65. He was slow and old at 50. You could walk the whole length of the road and not find a nuclear family, and definitely not come upon a neighborhood child. In fact, the only men or children around were outsiders who came to the quarter a few hours a day for two of its main services, refreshment and education. Just after the Gulf War, I started out by living in a basement apartment. I was a poor student. Then I got married and graduated just a few houses down the road to a much nicer, older, modest family mansion that had been a family shrine. Alex, my husband, and I found ourselves trying to cram our modest pile of belongings into a full-fledged family shrine. There was only one thing to do: gut the place. Although living in million-dollar real estate, the surviving Miss Havishams were, to put it kindly, a thrifty lot. Each time I carried yet another 40-year collection of useful jam jars out to the neighborhood tip, I'd find one of them unapologetically sifting through my last haul. I'll never forget the sight of Midget Lady pulling out an orange plastic urn from the tip and waving it triumphantly over her head. Once the dusty contents of the entire house had made their way out the front door and slowly worked their way back into the corners and crevices of our neighbors' homes, we were finally ready to celebrate. Now, in the new house that we moved in, right next to it was an empty lot, which is still there. The empty lot had been the front garden of the Saudi embassy until 1967. To the back stood the building, now surrounded by a big metal fence and guarded by noisy dogs. The Israelis had confiscated it as enemy property and turned it into a listening station to keep tabs on the consulates in the neighborhood, but had left the front garden to fend for itself, probably in an attempt to keep a low profile. You only glimpsed the building's inhabitants twice a day when they tore in and out of their driveway at breakneck speed, just across from Abu Rahman's shop. This behavior always brought forth chuckles from Abu Rahman. What do they think? If they go fast, we won't know they're here? What made the joke even better was his and everybody else's conviction that our Keystone cops were actually from the Mossad. They don't let just anyone do this work, you know. It's international work spying on the consulates, I was told by Sid Usra, who seemed to think that only Israel's elite agents were good enough for the neighborhood. Then we go through the peace process and we get up to 1999. It was around this time that the Miss Havisham die-off began. First to go was Mary, and then a few months later, Midget Lady. Death then skipped a house and took Hisham, who lived above us. Each time one of them died, the quarter seemed to lose a little more of its memory. Their homes, now absent a shrine keeper, would be summarily stripped, renovated, and rented out as offices to anonymous foreign agencies and NGOs that came to promote the amnesia of peace. Family members not living in the city believed installing an international agency, besides providing more lucrative rents, was the best way to protect their inheritance from Israeli takeover. But the loss of the shrines and the shrine keepers and their takeover by outsiders felt just like forced evictions. A friend from the neighborhood took to calling them settlers because once a home fell into their hands, it would never again revert to Palestinian occupants. One morning I saw Sid Usra on the street standing over a blacksmith doing some welding at her front door. I walked up and found her looking haggard and still in her nightgown. then realized the entrance was a massive broken glass and black soot. Shaking her head, she explained that a Molotov cocktail had been held at the house in the middle of the night. I heard the crash of the bottle and woke up to find the front door on fire. Thank God we had the fire extinguisher. Her brother weighed in. We called the police. They showed up 5 hours later. Then Situsra looked at me in total incomprehension. They kept saying, "You must have enemies. Who are your enemies?" The blacksmith shut off the torch and let out a mumbled curse. If the Israeli police hadn't been so obscene, we might have laughed at their absurdity and self-delusion. Everyone knew who the enemies were, and only in an instant of terrifying desperation had Situsra momentarily forgotten this and inadvertently sought help from their quarters. Following the incident, Usra and her brother bunkered themselves behind a new steel door and shutters. She even had the blacksmith cover the small arched window above the front door. I'd always had to avoid peeping into their living room through the open door when I walked up the street. Now, with all of the lights blocked, I could barely see them even when I was inside. Once the caretaker of all of the ladies in the neighborhood, Usra was now the last of them. And I couldn't help feeling that this was why she'd been attacked. Because once the shrine keepers had gone and the foreign agencies moved in, I realized that they had been the keepers not just of their own homes, but of the entire quarter. Thank you.
Commissioner of Police in Calcutta, who was sent to Palestine as a counter-terrorism expert in the midst of the 1936 Palestinian Popular Revolt against mandate rule. Over the years, this muqata'a, or compound, as we now call it, has acquired layers of meaning. It was where the hated Israeli military governor of Ramallah established his headquarters shortly after the June War in 1967. It was also the site of my legal battles and those of many others, both in defense of political prisoners at the military court and in land cases where we attempted to, but rarely succeeded in defeating the Israeli claim that Palestinian land fell into the category of public land and consequently belonged to the Jewish people. It was only in January 1996, when the Palestinian Authority was established, that this compound was opened to the general public for a very brief period of time. How different was that first viewing from this one? Then there were many people, some solemn, some celebratory, walking respectfully into the interrogation rooms, into the prison, and into the courtrooms, accompanied by former prisoners who pointed out significant markers, places, objects, and writings scrawled on the wall. There was such euphoria then, a sense of pride that the prison and torture chambers, where so many suffered, had been liberated. In reverent silence, we followed the former prisoners who proudly guided us through the alleys of this labyrinthian structure, describing the suffering they had endured. Sometimes the memory of one of those who died under torture or in prison would surface and our guide would choke. We would stand in respectful silence, trying our best to imagine what none of us had had to endure. That stroll to the site of memories of those most aggrieved convinced me that I should abandon my apocalyptic fantasy. This place, I now thought, should be turned into a museum commemorating an important stage in the struggle waged from the occupied territories to resist the Israeli occupation, just as the prison of Khayyam in South Lebanon and Robben Island in South Africa had been after liberation. June 5th, 2011. Unlike the previous years, This year, the 44th anniversary of the occupation passed unmarked. Life went on as normally as possible under a prolonged occupation. On my way to work, I was driving by the newly remodeled Muqata'a that now serves as the headquarters of the Palestinian Authority for its agenda of proving itself to the international community by building institutions. Of the old Taggart, only the small area which Arafat had made his hideout during the 2002 invasion of Ramallah remains. It has been turned into a museum commemorating the hardship and sacrifices of our dead leader. Now, the compound has high imposing walls with brand new watchtowers built by Palestinians, yet resembling those inspired by Sir Charles Taggart. The old section where the military courts and prison used to be has been completely leveled, and the new posh offices and residences of the President of the Palestinian Authority have taken its place. Between the walls and the streets, a grand garden with water fountains provides a separation between people and politicians for security reasons. I slowed my car as I approached the entrance to Arafat's gleaming limestone mausoleum on the southern border of this lavish headquarters of our remodeled self-governing authority. A ceramic plaque embedded in the wall announced the distance in kilometers to Jerusalem, the city which Arafat had hoped would be the capital of the Palestinian state and where he wanted to be buried. I was startled by a police siren leading a procession of cars with blackened windows ferrying a high Palestinian official perhaps, which zoomed by, almost knocking my car off the road. As the siren receded in the distance, I found myself thinking once again about what has happened to the Taggart compound on its hill, the site of such profound memories laden with historic significance. Was it a justifiable transformation of a dismal past into a promising future? How could that be when the heroic past of those who suffered and paid heavily remains unsung, with the sight of their memories eradicated? The question I have so often asked myself returned. Should I have left Palestine when I could well imagine what was in store for us? After the Oslo Accords were signed, I annoyed my friends with gloomy prophecies. Many have ended up as realities. Should I then have spared myself the pain and frustration? It's a moot question, perhaps. In fact, I both stayed and left. I became an internal exile. It was the sight of this refurbished Taggart that brought this home to me. When will this exile end? Perhaps when we, Palestinians and Israelis living on this land, succeed in scraping away all the nonsense about the exclusive meanings we attribute to our small territory and our lives in it, and begin to live without the lies of divine rights and narrow nationalist narratives that are used to justify the designation of land for the exclusive use of members of one religious group. It will end when the land and its people are rid of illusions, when my life in Palestine ceases to be conceived as that of a Samit, Arabic for someone who is steadfast, and becomes that of a citizen. I will be free then to come and go as I choose without attaching layers of meaning to the simple act of leaving. I will be free to live elsewhere if I wished, without feeling I'm betraying anyone. When Palestine, Israel come to mean nothing more to their people than home. Only then will my state of exile come to an end, and with it, my sumud. Perhaps it would be possible then to leave this Taggart altogether and be satisfied with simply placing markers to indicate where there was once a prison, an Israeli court, a torture chamber, and the seat of an authority exercising self-rule under colonial occupation. All the moments of the dismal past would be marked and commemorated so that future generations would not forget how we struggled to arrive at a free life in the Middle East without borders.
From my point of view as one of the editors, I don't think any of our writers were mired in nostalgia, which I think is a very dangerous form of remembering, and leads probably to a lack of imagination. But we're trying to sort of, and one example is Bashara Dumani's piece, which starts with a memory that he doesn't know where it came from really. It's a song his father used to sing. His father in World War II Haifa. And he doesn't know, it's the only song he can sing, Bashara himself, in a Haifa dialect, and he has it somehow written on a little piece of paper when he was a child. And from this memory, he imagines his father's life at that time and what it means to him now. So I think each writer, because writers are very individual, took a different path into memory. Sharif al-Musa, who I spoke about before, remembered himself as a child in his refugee camp in Jericho, and then tried to see his children looking at this child and was afraid the child would not want to talk to them. I mean, so people had all sorts of ways that they made memory and imagination meet. And nobody had a grand solution. I just should report immediately, there are no grand solutions in this book. But what there are, I think, very good writing and interesting ways that people look at what is clearly from the discussion a very, very troubled present and try to make the past a resource rather than an exercise in nostalgia.
Thank our distinguished guests for coming tonight. Thank you very much.